It was the summer of 2011. I was 17 years old, spending a weekend in the middle of nowhere with my family. My folks owned a small patch of land up in northern Michigan, nestled deep in the woods. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a little cabin my dad had built himself years ago and a decent-sized patch of land surrounded by trees, rocks, and thick underbrush. It wasn't much, but it was our place to get away from the chaos of city life. I had always loved it up there. It was peaceful. The air was different, fresh, with the smell of pine and damp earth that somehow made everything feel more alive. You could hear every little thing, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the calls of distant birds, the cracking of twigs underfoot. At night, though, it was a different story. The woods were quiet, still, too still. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But that night, there was something else in the air, something heavier. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew it. We'd set up camp near the edge of the forest, just outside the cabin. The plan was to spend 2 nights out under the stars. I brought along my dog, a Chow Lab mix named Diesel. Diesel wasn't your average dog. He was built like a tank, stocky, broad-shouldered, and tough, but had the personality of a teddy bear. He'd never been aggressive. Not once in his life had I seen him act out of character. He was loyal, laid back, and usually as harmless as they come. The first night was calm. We had a campfire going, roasted marshmallows, and chatted into the evening until we all turned in for the night. Diesel slept next to me, curled up at the foot of the tent, like he always did. But the second night, that's when everything changed. I don't know what woke me up at first. Maybe it was the oppressive silence that seemed to settle over the camp or the cold creeping into my bones. I blinked in the dark, trying to focus on the low sounds around me. Diesel was up. His large frame was stiff as a board, standing in the center of the tent, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. Not just any growl, either. It was low and vibrating, like it was coming from deep in his chest, almost subsonic. Something wasn't right. My heart skipped a beat. The tent was pitch black, and I couldn't make out anything beyond the outline of Diesel, his body tense and rigid. His hackles were raised, his teeth bared, and his eyes were wide, scanning the space around him with an intensity one had never seen before. Diesel wasn't scared of anything, but he wasn't just growling for no reason. I strained my ears, listening. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the leaves and twigs outside the tent. A low, rhythmic sound, but it wasn't just footsteps. Every now and then, I could hear a snort. It sounded like someone, or something, was breathing heavily, deep and wet, just outside the fabric of the tent. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Every muscle in my body was locked in place. Diesel was doing a slow, methodical turn, scanning the entire perimeter of the tent. He was tracking something that was circling us, moving with purpose. The growl that had been a constant, almost soothing vibration in the air suddenly deepened, turning into a guttural sound that rattled my bones. Diesel took a step forward, still turning in place, eyes glued to the entrance flap of the tent. His posture had shifted. He was no longer just alert, but fully on edge. Whatever was out there was near. I had no flashlight, no weapon, nothing. I was just lying there, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for whatever was lurking outside to make its move. My mind raced through every possibility, none of them good. Was it a bear? A wolf? Maybe a large animal, too big for a deer, lurking in the shadows? The footsteps stopped. There was a long pause, and all I could hear was the sound of Diesel's low growls and the rhythmic snorts coming from the other side of the tent. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me. Time felt like it slowed down. Every second stretched into eternity. My fingers gripped the edge of my sleeping bag, the fabric crinkling beneath my nails. I tried to take a breath, but it caught in my chest. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back, the fear crawling up my spine. Diesel finally completed his circle, turning his back on the entrance flap, but he didn't stop watching. He was still fixated, watching the spot where the sound had come from. I shifted slightly, barely daring to move, but the air was thick with the unease of it all. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't know. I had no concept of time anymore. Every rustle outside, every creak of the tent seemed amplified, sharp, like it was happening right next to me. My eyes were fixed on the flap, expecting it to burst open at any moment. Eventually, Diesel's growls tapered off. His body began to relax, though his muscles were still taut, ready to spring into action at the slightest disturbance. Slowly, he lowered his head, but his eyes never left the entrance. He settled down on the ground next to me, his body still like a rock, unmoving and vigilant. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, both of us staring at the entrance flap, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But nothing came. The snorting ceased. The footsteps had disappeared. The woods fell back into that strange, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, painting the sky with faint shades of purple and gold, Diesel let out a long, soft exhale. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but I wasn't fooled. Whatever had been out there, whatever had made that noise, was still there, somewhere, watching. I didn't wait around to find out. The moment the sun was fully up, I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, pulling my clothes on in a hurry. Diesel was already up, his ears perked, but the intensity had left him. He followed me out of the tent without a sound, though his eyes kept darting back toward the trees, as if expecting something to appear. I packed up the campsite as fast as I could, my hands shaking, the hairs on the back of my neck still standing on end. Diesel stayed close, never straying far from my side. We didn't waste any time packing everything into the car and heading back to the cabin. I was out of there so fast, I didn't even look back. As we drove away from the woods, the stillness of the forest began to fade into the distance, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept glancing at Diesel, who had settled down in the passenger seat, his eyes still wide, alert. He wasn't just a dog, he was a protector. And that night, he had saved me from something I didn't want to understand. I don't know what was out there that night, but I know it wasn't just a wild animal. Diesel knew it too. Whatever it was, it wasn't natural, and it was waiting for us. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that you only get in fall in British Columbia. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months, the perfect opportunity to escape the noise of the city and get a little peace. I'm a seasoned camper, used to setting up in remote areas where the only sounds you hear are the rustling of the trees and the rush of the river. So when I found a free spot along the Coquihalla River, I figured it would be the ideal place for a quiet weekend. It wasn't totally isolated, but it was far enough out of the way that it wasn't likely to see many other campers, especially this time of year when most people stayed home to prepare for winter. I'd arrived around mid-afternoon and quickly set up my tent in a small clearing by the riverbank. The site was simple: a fire pit with a few logs scattered around it, a beat-up wooden table with splintered edges, and a good stretch of land with trees towering above me. There was a chill in the air, but nothing unusual for this time of year. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the colors of the leaves were just beginning to change, a beautiful mix of reds, yellows, and oranges. I spent the next hour unpacking and setting up camp. I didn't mind doing the work. It was part of the ritual I enjoyed when I camped solo. I set my stove on the table, prepared a simple meal, and then settled in by the fire to relax for a bit. The night crept in quickly, as it always does in the woods. The fire crackled and popped, and the sounds of the river rushing over the rocks provided a soothing backdrop. I had a cold beer in hand, the warmth of the flames on my face, and for a moment, everything felt right. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, but after a while I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't the typical peaceful feeling I normally get when I camp in these types of spots. It was more like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and every so often, I would get the distinct sense that I wasn't alone. It was hard to describe, but it felt like eyes were on me. I kept looking around the clearing, half expecting to see someone lurking just outside the reach of the firelight. But the only thing moving were the trees, swaying in the breeze, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I shook it off as just nerves. After all, I'd camped alone plenty of times before and nothing had ever happened. This was a well-used site, one that other campers had likely visited many times. No reason to think it was anything out of the ordinary, but still I couldn't shake the feeling. As the night wore on, I began to feel more and more on edge. The wind picked up a little, making the forest feel alive in a way that was more unsettling than calming. I tried to distract myself, fiddling with my phone, but there was no signal out here. The sky had long since gone black, and I figured I might as well just get into my tent and try to get some sleep. I've never been the kind of person to let fear stop me from doing anything. But that night, I felt a genuine sense of unease. My stomach churned slightly as I crawled into the warmth of my sleeping bag. I turned on my portable speaker, setting it to a podcast I'd been listening to about some random true crime story, hoping that the sound would block out whatever sense of discomfort I was feeling. I didn't usually need distractions to sleep, but tonight was different. The podcast droned on, but I found it hard to focus. My mind kept wandering, imagining strange noises outside the tent. I swear I could hear footsteps moving around the perimeter of the campsite, slow and deliberate. But when I checked the window of my tent, I saw nothing. The wind was blowing through the trees, but the footsteps didn't match the rhythm of the wind. They were too purposeful. I forced myself to relax, taking deep breaths, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, faint rustling sounds, and once, the distinct creak of a branch moving under pressure. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but I wasn't sure. It felt wrong, though, like someone was trying to stay hidden in the woods, just out of sight, watching. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the campsite. I woke up groggy and disoriented, still feeling that weird, lingering sense of unease. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, stretching my arms above my head. The cool air of the forest hit me instantly, and I took a deep breath. I could hear the river flowing steadily in the background, and the sounds of birds calling out from the trees. But there was something about the quiet that felt almost oppressive. I went about my usual morning routine, boiling water for coffee and making breakfast. I was still a little shaken from the night before, but I figured it was just nerves. Nothing more. I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that I'd been camping in far more remote and sketchy places before. This spot was no different. As I set my coffee on the table, I noticed something strange. There was a hat on the wooden surface, a worn-out, faded baseball cap that looked like it had seen better days. It was dark blue with a frayed brim, and the fabric was starting to peel at the seams. At first, I thought I must have overlooked it the night before. Maybe it was something I'd set down while unloading my gear, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. I'd spent a good chunk of time setting up camp, and I knew I hadn't seen the hat when I'd placed my stove on the table. I would have noticed something like that. I walked closer, my heart rate quickening. There was no way this hat had been there when I set up camp. I hadn't even seen anyone nearby when I arrived. No one had passed through the area, at least not that I noticed. So how did this hat get here? I turned it over, half expecting to find some kind of identification, but there was nothing. No name, no logo, just the wear and tear of someone who had used it for a long time. My mind began to race. I thought back to the night before, the strange feeling I'd had, the sounds of someone moving around the campsite. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had come into my camp. Someone had been watching me. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the hat. The reality of the situation started to sink in. Whoever had been here didn't want to be seen. They'd left no trace, no footprints, no other signs that they'd been in the area. It was almost like they were trying to stay hidden, but they had left this hat behind, either as a mistake or as some kind of bizarre message. I quickly packed up my gear and started walking down the riverbank, my mind buzzing with questions. Who had been here? What were they doing? I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it could have been someone picking mushrooms or just passing through. Maybe a local who knew the area. But deep down, I felt that nagging, unsettling feeling again, the sense that I had been watched the night before. As I hiked back toward my car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. The hat still sitting on the table, a silent reminder of the unease that had settled in my chest. The forest was quiet now, and the wind had died down, but the weight of the experience lingered in my mind. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But as I loaded my gear into the car and drove away, I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't alone out there in the woods. Someone had been watching, and they were still out there. I had never been one to get nervous on the water. I'd been sailing since I was a kid, and the ocean, despite its unpredictable nature, always felt like a second home. But this night was different. It was late October, the weather unusually warm for the season. The moon hung high in the sky, barely hidden behind thin clouds, casting a dim light over the bay. The boat, a small 24-foot sloop, bobbed gently against the water, anchored a few hundred feet from the shoreline of a small island. It was just me, the boat, and the open ocean. Nothing more, nothing less. I had no particular reason to be out there that night. I wasn't camping, I wasn't on some grand adventure, hell, I wasn't even on a scheduled trip. I'd been visiting a few friends who lived in the area, and after a long day of eating too much and drinking even more, I decided I'd take a quick solo trip out to the bay. Something about the quiet and the dark, with the occasional rustle of wind in the trees on the shore, made the idea of being on the water calming. So, I set out around 10 p.m., under a sky full of stars. The bay was secluded, and the closest harbor was miles away, so there was no chance of anyone coming out to check on me. I didn't need help, though. I was used to the solitude. The boat was small but sturdy, perfect for a night like this. I had my anchor out and the engine off, letting the gentle current take me where it would. The water lapped at the hull in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic way. I leaned back on the deck, closing my eyes, letting the sounds of the water and the night wash over me. I was half drunk, to be honest, and had no particular plans except to enjoy the night for as long as I could. The faint smell of salt water and the cool breeze were a welcome escape from the stuffy atmosphere back on land. Then it started. It was faint at first. A sound, distant and muffled by the wind, just barely audible over the gentle waves. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe an animal on the shore, or some strange creaking noise from the boat. But as I sat up, rubbing my eyes, I realized it was something else, something unmistakable. A scream. Not just any scream, but the kind that claws at your gut. A man's voice, shrill, desperate, and full of raw terror. The word, "help!" echoed through the bay, carried by the wind. It wasn't loud, but it was piercing. Imagine a man in the throes of his final moments, being dragged beneath the waves, his body torn apart by something unseen. That's the kind of scream. It was horrifying, gut-wrenching, full of agony. It wasn't the kind of sound that you could just ignore. I froze. My heart began to race, and the blood drained from my face. It wasn't that I was scared. I had heard all kinds of noises on the water before, especially at night. But this was different. This sounded real. The kind of scream that didn't belong in nature. I stood up quickly, peering over the side of the boat, scanning the water around me with the flashlight I had at hand. There was nothing. No sign of movement. No dark shapes in the water. Nothing. Just the soft ripple of the ocean as it shifted in the current. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard. The scream came again, louder this time, sharper. Help! It echoed over the bay, the word bouncing off the rocks on the shore. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from all directions, but mostly from the east, where the shore curved around a small, jagged point of land. I spun the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing, just the moonlit water stretching out in front of me. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" My voice felt weak, swallowed up by the vastness of the night. But it didn't matter. The scream came again, as if mocking my feeble attempt. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. The thought of calling for help. Who would even come out here at this time of night? The bay was deserted, and the nearest Coast Guard station was miles away. My mind kept racing. Maybe it was a prank? Some kind of bizarre echo of a noise I didn't fully understand? But the more I listened, the more certain I became that this was no joke. Another scream. This one seemed closer. My body stiffened. I could feel the adrenaline now, rushing through me like an electric current. The idea of someone in distress was undeniable, and despite the fear crawling up my spine, I had to do something. I grabbed the oars, pushing them into the water with all my strength, trying to move toward the direction I thought the screams were coming from. But the boat barely moved, too heavy, too stubborn against the water. I cursed again. It was pointless. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the horrible scream echoing from the distance. It went on like that for what felt like an eternity. Scream, silence, scream, silence. Each one dragging me deeper into a state of confusion and fear. Felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The sound was too clear, too human, too real. And yet, I could see nothing. No boats on the horizon. No other lights, no people, nothing. Just me, the boat, and the infinite black water. The wind picked up, and the temperature seemed to drop. The air was heavy, thick with an uncomfortable stillness, and for the first time I felt utterly alone. There was no one else out here. There couldn't be. The scream came again, this time closer. It was more desperate now, strained, as though whatever was making it was in its final moments. I turned the flashlight toward the shore, again scanning the edges of the bay. No movement, no shape, no figures on the land. The boat rocked as the wind kicked up, the waves breaking a little more violently against the hull. I wanted to believe it was some kind of animal, some noise carried by the wind, or even my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more, something real. The next time the scream came, it sounded different. It wasn't as sharp, not as shrill, but it had a certain finality to it, a kind of resigned pleading that made my blood run cold. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, had given up. And then there was silence, total, unnerving silence, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, suffocating you, making every moment feel like an eternity. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No screams, no sounds, no movement. just the sound of the water gently lapping against the side of the boat. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly, I had to leave. I couldn't stay there anymore. The fear had twisted into something else, something I couldn't explain. Without thinking, I started up the engine, yanked up the anchor, and turned the boat away from the shoreline. The boat sputtered to life with a roar, and I accelerated, heading back toward the harbor. When I finally made it back to shore, my hands were shaking, my head spinning. I went straight to the harbor master, my voice trembling as I told him what had happened. I didn't know what to expect, but all he did was nod, making a note of it on a pad. He didn't seem particularly concerned, almost as if he had heard stories like mine before. "There's nothing I can do about it," he said, a little too casually. Maybe it was just someone out there playing a prank, or maybe it was some kind of animal, but I wasn't convinced. I kept checking the news for weeks afterward, waiting for any reports about missing people or strange occurrences in the area. But there was nothing. No news, no updates, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. I even asked around, but no one seemed to have any idea what I was talking about. To this day, I still don't know what I heard that night. Was it a man, truly in danger, screaming out for help? Or was it something else? An animal? A prank? Or my own mind unraveling in the dead of night? I'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that when I close my eyes, I can still hear that scream, the desperation, the terror. And no matter how hard I try to explain it away, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night. Something I couldn't see. Something that will never be fully understood. I never went back out to that bay again. And I never will. It was early October, the air crisp with the scent of pine and wet leaves. We were 2 days into our trip, deep in the wilds of northern Wisconsin. The kind of wild that swallows up all sound, where even the smallest breeze seems to whisper across the dense forest. We had paddled our way down a quiet river, one of those that doesn't have a name on any map, a stream that might have been around before the settlers showed up and could probably outlast us, too. There's a feeling you get in places like that, an unsettling, heavy quiet, like you're not entirely alone, but you're not sure who else is out there. The morning started off beautifully. Sunlight broke through the towering trees, splintering across the water like shattered glass. The forest was alive, in a way only a place this untouched can be. Birds calling, the wind swaying the branches in a rhythmic dance. But as the sun climbed higher and the morning wore on, the warmth of the day started to fade, and the chill of the coming evening crept in early. We were portaging, moving our canoe from one stretch of water to another. Portaging is one of those tasks that takes a bit of patience, a bit of grunt work, and a lot of teamwork. The trail was narrow and winding, the earth beneath our boots spongy with years of rotting leaves and moss. The kind of trail that feels like it's been abandoned, like it hasn't seen a human footstep in ages. The trees towered over us, their gnarled roots reaching out like old hands. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine needles, a distinct scent that clings to your skin even after you've left the woods behind. There were 2 of us on this trip, me, a 28-year-old city guy who thought he had a decent grasp of the outdoors, and my buddy, Will, who'd been at this for years. Will was a quiet guy, a little older, maybe 35, with a knowledge of the woods that seemed almost second nature. He wasn't one for stories or unnecessary words, but when he spoke, you listened. He knew what to look for, how to navigate, and how to survive out here. We'd been walking for a while, lugging the canoe between us, the heavy fiberglass digging into our shoulders as we moved slowly along the path. I remember my muscles aching, my knees sore from stepping over roots, but I didn't mind. This was supposed to be the best part of the trip, after all. The stretch between the river, where we had paddled, and the next lake, where we'd find the camp we'd stay at that night. But that peace, what little there was of it, came to a screeching halt in an instant. Will was ahead of me, eyes scanning the trail. I had just taken a step forward, about to call out to him, when I saw it. A rustling from the woods to our left. No, not just a rustling. A snapping. The kind of snap you get when something big, something heavy, is pushing through the underbrush. A thick, deep sound that felt wrong. Too close. Before I could say anything, Will stopped dead in his tracks. His posture stiffened, his hand suddenly lifting in a signal for silence. I froze. The snapping sound stopped, but there was no more peace. There was no sudden burst of life, no flutter of birds or scurry of squirrels. It was quiet now, too quiet. I could feel my breath in my throat, and my heart began to pound in my chest. The sweat on my back had nothing to do with the work of carrying the canoe. Will's eyes shifted around, but he didn't move. He stood still as stone, and I could feel the weight of the moment settling between us, a palpable tension. And then I saw them, emerging from the edge of the trail, just a few feet in front of us, were two calves. They were young, their fur a mixture of brown and black, soft and wet from the early morning mist. They didn't seem to notice us at first. They were too busy pushing through the low shrubs, grazing on the underbrush, oblivious to the fact that we were right there. But then, out of the woods behind them, a larger shape appeared. The mother, a massive cow, her dark eyes wide and alert. She moved with purpose, like a creature that knew exactly where it was going. The calves didn't make a sound, but the mother did. Her nostrils flared, and her head swung toward us, locking eyes with me in a way that made my blood run cold. Time slowed down. I could feel my breath catching in my chest. My instinct, the one that is deeply ingrained in the bones of every human, was screaming at me to run, to turn, drop the canoe, and sprint in the opposite direction. The adrenaline surged through my body, filling every inch of my skin with a tight, electric feeling. My legs felt like they were already moving, but my feet were frozen in place, pressed into the wet soil. Will didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving the mother. I could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, matching the pace of the forest around us. His hand slowly reached for his pack, unzipping it quietly. I could see the muscles in his arm twitch, his body ready to respond at a moment's notice. But we didn't make any sudden moves. Neither of us dared to. I wanted to yell at him to run, to grab the canoe and run until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. But I didn't. We just stood there, in the heavy silence, staring at the animals. The mother, still standing at the edge of the trail, took a step forward, her hooves muffled by the thick layer of leaves underfoot. Her massive frame seemed to block out the sunlight as she stepped forward again. Her eyes, dark and filled with a strange intensity, never left mine. She was big, really big, bigger than I had expected. In my mind, I thought of cows as these docile, gentle creatures. I had seen them in fields, grazing lazily, but this was different. This was a wild animal protecting her young. I could see the muscles rippling under her skin as she shifted her weight. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with a farm animal. I was dealing with something that could hurt us badly if we made the wrong move. We were still a few feet away, but with every step she took, the distance between us seemed to close faster than I could process. I could hear the sound of my heart thundering in my ears. The calves didn't help. They had started to move closer now, one of them sidestepping cautiously toward the path we were standing on. The other seemed to stay behind the mother, but they were both curious, too curious for my liking. The air was thick, suffocating in its intensity. I could see Will's grip on his pack tighten. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, but his posture was like a coiled spring, ready to react. He didn't speak, but I knew what he was thinking, what we both were thinking. The cow wasn't making a move yet, but if she charged, we needed to be ready. I barely breathed. It felt like minutes passed as we stood there, locked in this standoff with a wild animal who felt every inch of the forest as her own. The tension built, thick and choking, until the mother finally took one more step, and I thought, just for a second, that she was going to charge. I don't know why I didn't react. I don't know what stopped me, but I didn't move. Neither did Will. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. The mother cow backed away, her calves following her closely, retreating back into the thick brush where they came from. She didn't turn her back to us completely, her eyes still on us, but she moved slowly, cautiously, as if testing to see if we were a threat. I thought I could breathe again, but I didn't. We stood there for another few moments, not moving, not breathing too loudly. And when I was sure the danger had passed, I exhaled. Will was the first to speak. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge to it that I didn't miss. I nodded. Without another word, we turned around and started walking back down the trail, the canoe still between us. We moved slowly, deliberately, making sure not to turn our backs on the woods. It was a long time before I felt like the adrenaline had fully left my body. The woods were still, but that feeling of something lurking was still there. It was hours before we made camp. By the time we reached the site, the sun had long set. We sat by the fire, too tired to talk much. It wasn't until the flames crackled and the shadows danced across our faces that I realized how close we had come. How close I had come to making a decision I might not have come back from. Out here, in the wild, you don't always have the luxury of second chances. We survived. The animals were gone, but the memory of those dark, watchful eyes lingered in my mind long after the fire had died out. It was a reminder that nature, no matter how beautiful, is just as unforgiving as it is serene. And we weren't as big as we thought. The rain had just stopped when my dad, my sister, and I decided to go camping. It wasn't the best timing. It was already late in the evening, around 10 p.m., but my dad, always the spontaneous type, thought we should go for it. He'd been itching for some time outdoors, and this was his way of making up for the last few weekends we'd spent indoors. I didn't really mind at first. We didn't have any plans, and honestly, the idea of getting away from everything for a while sounded nice. But there was something about that night that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the damp air still clinging to everything, the puddles of water collecting on the ground, or the dense trees surrounding us as we pulled into the parking lot of the campgrounds. It was eerily quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. The rain had been heavy earlier, leaving everything glistening and dark, and I could smell that earthy, wet scent that always followed a storm, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and sticks there. My dad had a big grin on his face as he got out of the car, grabbing the tent from the trunk. "Come on, you two. Let's get set up before it gets any darker." I wasn't sure if it was my exhaustion or the lingering sense of unease, but the thought of setting up the tent in the dark, with just the dim light of the car headlights illuminating the trees around us, made my skin crawl. My sister, Emily, didn't seem to care. She was already running ahead, her boots splashing through the mud, excited to set up our little camp. But I stayed back for a second, looking at the thick trees around the campsite. I couldn't see much beyond the reach of the headlights, but I felt like something was out there, watching us. Shaking it off, I grabbed the tent bag and followed Emily. My dad was already starting to unpack the poles. He had always been the one to take charge when we went camping, and honestly, I trusted him. But that night, there was a subtle shift. It wasn't just the quiet that made the air feel thick and strange. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We set up the tent with the quick efficiency my dad was known for. But with every snap of a pole or zip of the bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind picked up, and the trees started to creak, as if they were settling into their positions for the night. I kept looking around nervously, glancing at the shadows beyond the small bubble of light that surrounded our tent. "All right, I think that's it," my dad said after a while, standing back to admire his work. "Let's get inside and get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day, and we'll need to rest." I wasn't sure if I felt better or worse about going into the tent, but we all crawled inside, and it wasn't long before I heard the soft rustle of the rain picking up again outside. The sound of water hitting the fabric of the tent was oddly soothing, but my mind still wouldn't let go of the strange feeling I had. It wasn't until I finally got comfortable and my eyelids started to get heavy that I felt a creeping sense of dread, like something was standing right next to the tent. I was drifting in and out of consciousness when I first heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking carefully, trying not to make a sound. I told myself it was probably just an animal or even another camper, though I couldn't remember hearing anyone else around. The footsteps kept going, though, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to grow louder the more I tried to ignore it. I was so tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that shouldn't be. I tried to stay still, listening. My dad and Emily were both already asleep, or at least pretending to be. I felt a sense of isolation creep over me, knowing we were alone in the middle of the woods at such a late hour. And then, in my peripheral vision, I saw it. My dad. He wasn't just sitting there, resting. He shot up, fast, way too fast, like something had startled him. His body stiffened, his breathing loud and uneven. My stomach dropped. I was still half asleep, but the panic in my dad's sudden movement jolted me wide awake. I turned to look at him, a little confused. "What are you doing?" I whispered harshly, almost demanding an answer. I was still too tired to be fully alert, but something was wrong. But then I heard it. Big, heavy footsteps, right outside the tent. Not the light padding of animals, but something human? No, too heavy, too deliberate, something much bigger. My breath caught in my throat, my heart starting to race. My dad was still frozen, not saying anything, but the air was thick with the tension of something about to happen. And then the growl, low, deep, almost like it came from the earth itself. I swear, I thought I was going to die right there. My whole body went cold. The footsteps stopped, but the growling didn't. It rumbled again, closer now, and I could hear the sound of something heavy moving against the tent's fabric. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, and all I could think was that we were about to be torn apart by whatever was on the other side of that fabric. My dad yelled, "Get out of here!" at the top of his lungs, and it was the most terrified I'd ever heard him sound. And then it happened. A huge force slammed into the tent, so hard that I was thrown back against the ground. The fabric of the tent tore in several places, and I could feel the vibrations of something massive outside. Something with claws or something with strength swiping at the tent. The whole thing shook. We could hear the sharp scrape of claws against the fabric, the deep growl rumbling again, just outside our thin walls of nylon. For a long time, we didn't move. We couldn't. I remember my hands were shaking uncontrollably as I clutched the edge of my sleeping bag, trying to hold onto some sense of reality. My dad was still silent, but I could hear him breathing hard in the darkness. I didn't know what to do. We were trapped. The growling stopped eventually, but that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made it worse. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity, and we all lay there, holding our breath, waiting for the next move. The tension in the air was unbearable. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes, my dad finally whispered, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." I heard him shift, and I could sense him inching toward the zipper of the tent. I wanted to scream, to beg him to wait, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the thing outside could hear it. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever came next. Then, after what seemed like forever, the tent door unzipped with a sharp sound. Slowly, painfully slow, my dad pushed the flap back just enough to peer outside. The silence was broken by the sound of his breath catching in his throat. After another minute of absolute stillness, my dad exhaled and quickly zipped the door back up. "It's gone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to say. Part of me didn't believe him, but I was too scared to argue. The moment had broken me in a way I couldn't explain. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't get my breath under control. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent door fully. There, just a few feet away from where our tent had been, were deep claw marks embedded in the soft earth, right through the puddles left by the rain. The ground was torn up as if something had tried to dig its way through. The tent had been swatted with such force that it had multiple tears along the side, and my dad's gear was scattered outside. We packed up quickly, no one saying much. None of us really wanted to talk about it, but we all knew we were lucky to have made it out of there. I still have that tent, and every time I look at the scars on it, I remember how close we came to something much worse. That night still haunts me, and every time I go camping now, I can't help but feel a little uneasy when the wind picks up and the woods get quiet. I'll never forget the sound of those heavy footsteps and that growl in the darkness.